Chapter 1. The Power of Prophecy Over Leaders. While the world watches radar and satellites, two men in opposing bunkers looked at something much older. Benjamin Netanyahu and Amalek Code did not share just a map of war. They shared a book, a text that dictated their movements before their generals gave the order. What you are about to discover is not politics. It is a destiny written 2,500 years ago that is dragging us toward the abyss. We tend to think that modern leaders make decisions based on economics or military strategy. But in the heart of the Middle East, the logic is different. For Netanyahu, every speech about Israel's survival was steeped in biblical echoes. For Khamenei, the former supreme leader of Iran, geopolitics was merely the stage for the return of a mystical figure who would change the cosmos. But what if I told you that both were reading the exact same passage, each convinced the other was a villain of the story? It was no coincidence. Netanyahu frequently mentioned Amalek, the ancestral enemy of Israel that must be blotted out from memory. It was not a political metaphor. It was a religious command. At the same time, in calm, the advisors of Khamenei analyzed the signs of the hour, the moment when chaos would precede final justice. Both leaders saw themselves not as politicians, but as instruments of a higher will. The problem was that when two men believe God is on their side, negotiation becomes impossible. And this is where the Cyrus Factor came in. In 2018, a commemorative coin was minted in Israel. On it, the face of Donald Trump appeared alongside that of Cyrus the Great, the Persian king who freed the Jews from Babylon. To the world, it was a diplomatic gesture. To scholars of prophecy, it was a warning sign. Iran is ancient Persia. The same territory that was once the savior of Israel became, in their time, its greatest existential threat. How did Persia go from being the anointed one of the Bible to being the axis of evil? The answer lies in a verse that both leaders kept under lock and key, a code linking modern oil to the sacred fire of the prophets. It was said that in moments of high tension, Netanyahu would retreat to study the books of Kings. He looked for patterns. He looked to see if this was the final confrontation, or just a prelude. Meanwhile, in the mosques of calm, whispers spread that the great Satan and his allies were fulfilling, step by step, the conditions for the collapse of the world order. They were not fighting over borders. They were fighting over fulfillment of a script that neither of them dared to close. But there is a detail that almost all analysts ignored. There was a specific name in the book of Isaiah, a name that described a leader who would come from the east to subdue nations. Netanyahu thought he knew who it was. Khamenei was sure it was himself. Chapter 2, Isaiah 45, the anointed Cyrus in Iran. Imagine opening a sacred book from 2,500 years ago and finding your own name, or that of your worst enemy, written in the stars. Netanyahu knew that Israel did not survive by luck, but by a Persian decree. And Khamenei knew that, according to that same text, he held the key to saving Jerusalem or to reduce it to ashes. The question is not whether the prophecy is real, but what they were willing to burn to fulfill it. The Bible has an anomaly that drives historians mad. In the book of Isaiah, chapter 45, God calls a man his anointed, his Messiah, but it does not refer to a prophet of Israel, but to Cyrus the Great, the king of Persia. It was a Persian, a direct ancestor of today's Iranians, who rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem. That is why when Netanyahu looked toward Tehran, he did not see only an enemy. He saw an heir who betrayed a sacred alliance. But what if Khamenei believed that he was the true Cyrus of this era? The verse says, "I will go before you and level the exalted places. I will break in pieces the doors of bronze." Netanyahu cited this concept of leveling the way before the U.S. Congress, suggesting that the destiny of the West depended on who controlled those doors. For Israel, Iran was the fallen Persia, the dark mirror of what was once its protector. But here is where the story becomes terrifying. In Iran, the official theologians argue that the verse did not speak of the past, but of a future conquest that had not yet occurred. For a leader like Netanyahu, who saw himself as a historical protector of the Jewish people, that Iran, the land of Cyrus, was the one now manufacturing missiles to destroy Israel, was the greatest blasphemy in history. It was a rupture in the fabric of time. For his part, Khamenei's rhetoric was not a gratuitous hatred. It was of purification. He believed he was rescuing the region's legacy from the clutches of what he called the Zionist entity. Both were trapped in a circle. One fought so that the past would not repeat itself, the other so that the prophetic future would accelerate. And there was a third element in this equation that Netanyahu studied obsessively at night. There is a word that made the Israeli security cabinet tense up: Amalek. In Jewish tradition, Amalek is pure evil that appears when people are weary. Netanyahu publicly identified Iran with this name. It was a declaration of total war, because with Amalek one does not sign peace, one exterminates it. But while Netanyahu searched for Amalek on the radars, Khamenei was searching for something much deeper in the Shia scriptures, something called the Mahdi. And according to his advisors, the appearance of his redeemer depended on a massive sacrifice that directly involved what Netanyahu feared most. Chapter 3. What Netanyahu studied about Amalek. There is a word that, if pronounced by a prime minister of Israel, is equivalent to pressing a red button. It is not war nor victory. It is Amalek. When Netanyahu used this term to refer to his current enemies, he was not giving a political speech. He was invoking a law of extermination that is 3,000 years old. In that moment, the rules of modern diplomacy died. To understand Netanyahu's obsession, one must understand what Amalek is. According to the Torah, it was the first nation that attacked the Israelites from behind as they fled Egypt. They did not seek territory. They sought the annihilation of the weak. Since then, Amalek is not just a people. It is a spirit of irrational hatred that reappears in every generation to try to erase Israel from a map. But here's the disturbing part. The biblical command against Amalek is to blot out its memory from under heaven. And Netanyahu believed he had identified exactly where that spirit lives today. In his nights of study at the residence on Gaza Street, Netanyahu connected points that others ignored. He saw the leaders of Tehran not as revolutionary politicians, but as the successors of Haman, the villain of the book of Esther, who tried to execute a genocide in ancient Persia. For the prime minister, history was a circle closing in on the present. If Iran was the new Amalek, the logical conclusion for Netanyahu was terrifying. There could be no truce, because with absolute evil one does not negotiate, one destroys it. This thinking was not only his. There was a wing of spiritual advisors who whispered to him that they were in the birth pangs of the Messiah. According to this vision, Israel must face its greatest enemy alone, so that the final redemption could be fulfilled. It was a theology of total risk. Netanyahu felt he was the wall of containment between civilization and the chaos that Amalek represented. However, while Israel prepared to blot out the memory of its enemy, in Tehran they were celebrating, because for them, this attack was the exact signal they had been waiting for. Khamenei's doctrine held that chaos was the fuel of the divine. If Netanyahu invoked Amalek, Khamenei responded with the justice of the oppressed. Both were feeding a bonfire they believed would consume the other, without realizing that they were reading the same instruction manual for the end of the world. It was not a war over gas or oil. It was a race to see who would reach the apocalypse first. But there was a secret that Khamenei had even from his closest generals. A prophecy about a hidden man who would only appear when blood reached the knees in Jerusalem. And that man had a name that made all of Shia Islam tremble. Chapter 4. The Shia Theology of the Mahdi and the Apocalypse. That name which made generals tremble and brought the faithful to their knees was not that of a living politician. It was the Mahdi, the 12th Imam. For Ali Khamenei, this man was not a myth. He was a real commander who lived in the shadows, waiting for the world to become chaotic enough to force his return. And according to Israeli intelligence, Khamenei believed that his mission was precisely to create that chaos. In Shia Islam, the Mahdi disappeared over 1,000 years ago, but he did not die. He was occulted. The theology that moved the strings in Iran said that he would return to establish a government of global justice. But there was fine print in the prophecy. His return would not come in times of peace. The Mahdi would only appear when injustice was absolute and the world was on the brink of extinction. This created a perverse incentive. If you accelerated the conflict in the Middle East, you were accelerating the arrival of God, and there was a specific place where the final battle must begin. For the leadership in Tehran, Israel was not just an enemy state. It was a theological obstacle. Shia prophecy suggested that before the Mahdi revealed himself in Mecca, an army with black banners would advance in the east Iran to liberate Jerusalem. Khamenei did not see his ballistic missiles as defensive weapons, but as tools of liturgy. But Netanyahu knew these prophecies as well as they did, and he had prepared a counter-strategy that seemed taken from a book of political science fiction. In a square in Tehran, the government had installed a countdown clock for the destruction of Israel. They said that by the year 2040, the Jewish state would cease to exist. What they did not say was that this clock did not measure years. It measured events. Each attack, each cyber operation, and each execution was 1 second less on that counter. Iran was playing a game of chess where the pieces were living prophecies. However, there was a problem in the Iranian plan. The Mahdi did not come alone. He was accompanied by a figure who also appeared in the Hebrew Bible, creating a terrifying bridge between both religions. Here was where the mind of strategists like Netanyahu and that of a cleric like Khamenei collided at the same point on the map, the Temple Mount. Both believed that whoever controlled that rock would control the flow of time. They were not fighting for democracy or sovereignty. They were fighting for who would have the right to welcome the end of days. But what if both leaders were falling into the same trap? There existed a manuscript by the Dead Sea that spoke of a war of the sons of light against the sons of darkness. And what it said about the meeting point suggested that Armageddon would not be a war of armies, but a collision of two realities that should not exist at the same time. Chapter 5, The Meeting Point, the War of Armageddon. If you look for the word Armageddon on a modern map, you will not find it. But if you look for Har Megiddo in northern Israel, you will be stepping on the valley where Netanyahu's generals and Khamenei's strategists believed the fate of the planet would be decided. It was not a conspiracy theory. It was a battle plan that both sides were rehearsing right now as you watch this video. Megiddo had been the scene of more battles than any other place on earth. From pharaohs to the British, all had fought there. For Netanyahu, this valley was a symbol of national resilience. For Khamenei's advisors, it was a bottleneck where Western nations would be threshed like wheat. Both leaders saw geography not as land, but as a board of fulfilled prophecy. But there was something in the soil of Megiddo that modern archaeology had just discovered, and that fit perfectly with a verse that both leaders kept in secret. There was a specific signal that Iran was waiting for. The Book of Revelation and certain Islamic traditions agreed on something: the drying up of the Euphrates River. For Tehran, the water crisis in Iraq and Syria was not an ecological problem. It was a green light for the advance of their armies toward the west. Netanyahu, a security expert, observed this troop movement disguised as regional chaos with terrifying clarity. He knew that the Euphrates was not just water. It was a border that, once crossed, would activate a defense protocol that Israel had not used in decades. It was rumored that there existed indirect communication channels where they did not speak of peace, but of roles. It was as if both sides knew they were performing a play written millennia ago. Netanyahu presented himself as the shield of David, Khamenei as the standard of the revolution. The fascinating thing was that neither of them tried to avoid the collision. They tried to ensure they were in the correct position when the collision occurred. However, there was an intelligence report that suggested something incredible: that both leaders had cited the same verse about the final hour in closed cabinet meetings. The true war of Armageddon was not about religion, but about who had the authority to say it is over. Netanyahu wanted to protect the present so that the Jewish future would be possible. Khamenei wanted to destroy the present so that the divine future would be inevitable. They were on a collision course where the winner would be whoever controlled the narrative of destruction. But there was a detail that escaped them. If they were truly following the script of the prophecies, the verse said that before the end, both leaders must receive a message from a third actor who was neither Jewish nor Muslim, an actor who had already begun to send signals in a language that only they could decode. Chapter 6. Secret quotes. Do they know their role? Imagine that the fate of the world is decided in a conversation where no one says what they truly think. Netanyahu and Khamenei did not speak to each other, but they constantly sent each other messages. They did not use diplomatic cables. They used verses. Every time one cited a prophecy, the other responded with troop movement that fit exactly with the next line of the book. It was not politics. It was a choreography of the end of times. To the average viewer, the speeches of these leaders were just aggressive rhetoric. But to experts in eschatology, they were traffic signs. When Netanyahu spoke of the light that will prevail over darkness, he was directly citing the Qumran scrolls. When Khamenei responded by speaking of the dawn that approaches, he did not mean the next morning, but a cosmic event that required the disappearance of his enemies. Both knew that the world was watching them, but only the two of them knew that they were following a script that, once started, had no pause button. The great question circulating in the halls of international intelligence was, did they truly believe these roles? The reports suggested they did. Netanyahu saw himself as the heir of the Maccabees, the warriors who reclaimed the temple. Khamenei saw himself as the preparer of the path for the Mahdi. They did not act out of personal ego, but out of historical responsibility that transcended them. But there was a risk. When a leader believes his destiny is written, he stops fearing consequences. And that was exactly what was happening with the nuclear program. It was said that years ago, through mediators in Oman, a message arrived from Tehran to Jerusalem that did not speak of uranium, but of times. The message was a question about a specific verse from the prophet Daniel. Israel's response was not a letter, but a deployment of F-35 fighters over the Mediterranean. It was a response in the same symbolic language. We are ready for the judgment. The most unsettling thing was that both seemed to agree that peace was impossible until a purifying event occurred at the Dome of the Rock. We were watching two men who had decided that the 21st century was just a stage to settle an old score from the 7th century. For them, modern technology was merely the means to fulfill ancient prophecies. GPS guided the missiles, but the Bible and the Quran guided those who pressed a button. They were so convinced of their role that they had stopped looking for diplomatic exits. However, while they stared at each other across the border, something was moving beneath the ground of Jerusalem, a discovery in the Dead Sea Scrolls that spoke of a third force, the Parthians. And what it said about them completely changed who was truly the ally and who was the enemy in this story. Chapter 7, the encoded language in their speeches. The Parthians. That was the name that had made Israeli intelligence review manuscripts from 2,000 years ago. They were not a legend. They were the only empire that made Rome tremble and that, according to Dead Sea Scrolls, would return from the east to decide the final battle. Netanyahu knew that, in the language of the prophets, the Parthians had a modern heir, and that heir was moving its pieces right now. In the caves of Qumran, a text titled The War of the Sons of Light was found. In it, an enemy was described that came from beyond the Euphrates. Historically, they were the Parthians, the mounted archers of Persia. But for Netanyahu, who read these texts with the gaze of a 21st century strategist, the Parthians were the coalition that today arms Iran. It was not just a country, it was an axis that stretched across Eurasia. But the manuscript said something no one expected. The Parthians did not come to destroy Israel. They came to clear the path. And that phrase was the one Khamenei used in his speeches to justify something unspeakable. If you listen carefully to Khamenei's last speech before the Revolutionary Guard, you would notice that he did not mention the word war. He spoke of the wind from the east that purifies. It was a code for the initiated. He was invoking the tactic of the ancient Parthians, the retreating attack, feigning weakness to lure the enemy into a deadly trap. Netanyahu responded days later by speaking of the iron wall that does not yield. It was a dialogue of the depth of the world, but a deadly chess game for them. And the board was literally the subsoil of Jerusalem. Here was where technology became mystical. The Fordal bunkers in Iran were excavated to a depth that, according to certain apocryphal texts, coincided with the chambers of the ancient kings. Khamenei believed that by building his nuclear power there, he was reclaiming the fire of the Parthians. Netanyahu, for his part, had named his intelligence operations after prophets who predicted the fall of Babylon. They were not launching satellites just to spy. They were trying to see if the signs in the sky described in the ancient texts were already visible from space. Netanyahu and Khamenei were so obsessed with each other that they might be ignoring the true warning of the Parthian manuscript. The text said that when the two kings face each other, the third will take the crown. That third actor was not in the Middle East. He was watching from the shadows of the global economy, waiting for both sides to exhaust themselves in their holy war. But there was a factor that changed everything. In chapter 8 of Daniel, it spoke of a ram and a goat. Netanyahu had been seen with a map that marked exactly where this clash would occur. And the most terrifying thing was that the location coincided with a nuclear facility that still did not appear on the official maps of the IAEA. Chapter 8. The Dead Sea Scrolls and the Parthians. The facility had no name on public maps, but in the corridors of the Mossad, they called it the altar. It was buried so deep that no conventional bomb could touch it. Netanyahu knew that what Iran was refining, there was not just uranium. It was a catalyst of a prophecy from the prophet Daniel that spoke of a fire that comes from the north. The world believed it was an energy crisis, but for the leaders, it was the ignition of an artificial sun. According to the most recent intelligence reports, Iran had built this facility following a specific geometry that coincided with ancient plans of Persian temples. Khamenei believed that atomic power was a modern manifestation of the glory of kings, Karina, a sacred fire that only the chosen could carry. For Netanyahu, this was a confirmation that his enemy had crossed the red line between defense and apocalyptic mysticism. But there was a papyrus in the Dead Sea that warned that whoever tried to steal the fire from the sky in the land of the Parthians would unleash a plague of darkness upon the cities. In chapter 8 of the book of Daniel, a brutal clash was described between a ram and a goat. The ram represented the kings of Media and Persia, present-day Iran. The goat came from the west with such speed that it did not touch the ground. Netanyahu had been seen reviewing this passage alongside his Air Force generals. For Israel, that goat was the F-35 stealth fighters, designed to strike before being detected. The problem was that the prophecy said the ram would be defeated, but from its fall something much more dangerous would be born that would affect the place of the sanctuary. The ancient Parthians were famous for their Parthian shot, firing while fleeing, turning their retreat into their deadliest attack. Khamenei had modernized this tactic. His proxy attacks were the arrows that wore down Israel while he took refuge behind his mountain shield. Netanyahu knew this. He knew that direct confrontation was exactly what the prophecy in Khamenei were seeking to force divine intervention. However, the Dead Sea Scrolls mention an object, a copper key, that supposedly indicated where the temple treasures were hidden to protect them from the Parthians. And that key had just been linked to a current GPS coordinate. For these two men, uranium was not just chemistry. It was alchemy. It was a tool to force the hand of God. Netanyahu believed that if he destroyed the altar, he saved the world. Khamenei believed that if the altar was attacked, the Mahdi would have no choice but to appear. They were playing with the fuel of the end of the world with a smile on their lips, convinced that they were protagonists of the last page of history. But while the world looked to the sky waiting for missiles, the prophetic clock had struck an hour no one expected. A verse in the book of Ezekiel spoke of a trembling of the earth that was not geological, and at that precise moment, the seismographs on the border between Israel and Iran had detected something that was not an earthquake, but a rhythmic pulse coming from the depths. Chapter 9, the nuclear factor as fulfillment. That pulse which the seismographs detected was not magma moving, nor a fault in the tectonic plates. It was something that military intelligence called a cavity signature. Iran had detonated something at an impossible depth, and it had not been a bomb. Netanyahu had convened his war cabinet not to talk about retaliation, but to read the book of Ezekiel, because according to the prophet, before the final invasion, the earth itself would cry out. In Khamenei's theology, uranium enriched to 90% was not just for a warhead. It was to create a purifying fire that would force the heavens to open. He believed that the nuclear factor was the only language the great Satan and its allies understood. But for the rabbis who advised Netanyahu, this Iranian advance was a sign of the smoke of Magog, a technical darkness that preceded the messianic light. What no one was saying in the news was that this rhythmic pulse beneath the ground coincided exactly with the resonance frequency of the foundations of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Netanyahu knew that if Iran reached the nuclear threshold, the rules of the game would change forever. There existed a secret protocol in Israel called the Samson Option, the idea that if Israel was going to fall, the entire world would fall with it. It was the darkest interpretation of force. Netanyahu did not see the nuclear weapon as a last resort, but as a fiery sword that guarded the modern Garden of Eden. But Khamenei had his own protocol, one that said that the sacrifice of an entire nation was a small price if it guaranteed the return of the hidden Imam. There was a verse in Zechariah that described a plague where the flesh of people will rot while they are still standing. For centuries, this was considered a terrifying miracle. Today, any physics student knew that this was an accurate description of acute radiation. Netanyahu and Khamenei were reading the same manual of side effects. One saw it as a threat to avoid, the other as a divine punishment to administer. However, intelligence services had intercepted a radio frequency coming from the Natan's nuclear facility. It was not military code. It was an ancient liturgical chant not heard since the fall of Babylon. They were at the 23rd hour of the prophetic clock. The nuclear factor had ceased to be a matter of international treaties and had become a fulfillment of a genetic destiny. Netanyahu had given the order that the texts of the minor prophets be analyzed by quantum computers to predict Khamenei's next move. The Iranian leader, for his part, had stopped using telephones. He believed his communication now was directly with destiny. But while the world waited for a flash in the sky, something had appeared on the shores of the Dead Sea. Cracks of fresh water were springing up where there had only been salt before. According to chapter 47 of Ezekiel, this was a final warning before time would stop, and the hour marked on the clock at Jerusalem was exactly the same as that of the launch. Chapter 10, the hour on the prophetic clock. Forget everything you thought you knew about modern warfare. The pulse that the seismograph detected was not a technical test. It was a warning that sacred geography was reclaiming its place in the present. Netanyahu and Khamenei were not playing at being gods. They were convinced they were the guardians of a threshold that was about to open. What happened at the Dead Sea was not a natural phenomenon. It was a sign that the time of men had collided with the time of the eternal. When fresh water burst forth from the most saline shores on the planet, intelligence analysts in Tel Aviv and Tehran did not look for answers in geology books. They looked in Ezekiel 47. For them, the appearance of life in the Dead Sea was the ultimate timer. Netanyahu knew that, according to tradition, this event preceded a transformation that no army could stop. Khamenei, for his part, saw in the spiritual thaw the proof that the stage for the Day of Judgment was finally set. But there was a detail that the radars could not hide. The structure beneath the Temple Mount had begun to emit a thermal signal that coincided exactly with the pulse detected in Iran. It was not common hatred that separated these two leaders. It was an extreme form of respect for destiny. Netanyahu read Israel's victories as the hand of providence. Khamenei read its resilience as the will of the Almighty. Neither of them minimized the other's faith. They feared it because they knew that both were reading the same playbook. If one moved, the other responded not by strategy, but by what he believed was a divine command. The real question that kept spies awake at night was, what would happen if both leaders discovered that the final verse did not speak of the victory of one over the other, but of something much greater? In the book of Daniel, the vision spoke of kingdoms falling like statues of clay. But there was a third kingdom, one that was not made by human hands. While the missiles sat in their silos, Netanyahu and Khamenei suspected that the true conflict was not between Iran and Israel, but between this world and the one to come. They were in a race to see who would be the first to decipher code that activated the intervention from on high. It was said that there existed a hidden scroll in the Vatican archives that connected Cyrus the Great with the final destiny of Jerusalem, and that both leaders had sent secret envoys to obtain a copy. They were on the threshold. The prophetic clock did not mark hours, it marked events. The fresh water flowed, the pulse persisted, and the skies seemed to be waiting for a signal. Netanyahu and Khamenei were at their posts, not as politicians, but as the last high priests of a fading era. They were not fighting over oil or land. They were fighting for the right to witness the moment when the veil between the seen and the unseen would tear. History had ceased to be written by journalists and had returned to the hands of the prophets. What you saw in the news was only the echo of a battle that had already occurred on the plane of the eternal. The clock had reached zero, and as you listened to this, the verse that both leaders read in secret was beginning to fulfill itself before your eyes. What you have just seen is only the surface of an ocean of mysteries that have been waiting for thousands of years. If you want to understand why the world moves as it does, do not watch the news, read the original text. The book of Daniel, Ezekiel, Isaiah. There lie the coordinates of what is coming. The question is, are you ready to read the script before it becomes reality? Subscribe so that we may continue writing the history of humanity on the physical plane and on the spiritual.